Okay, it's wonderful to be here. I'm from the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, so we think a lot about mountains, mostly in the Himalayan region, but I did want to point out the importance of mountains globally, that it's about 12% of the world's population lives in mountains, but 40% of the world's population depends somehow on the resources, for example, mountain or water, from mountain areas. And it's also, these are areas that are, like the Arctic, dealing with issues of climate change. Now, hopefully I can get this to work here. Next, I'm pushing. Yes, okay, great. This, the area in particular that we work in is called, we call it the Hindu Kush Himalaya. It's the green area. And it covers 8 different countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. So 8 countries who share this important resource. That's the green area. But we also think about the area downstream. That green area is connected to 10 major river basins supporting all kinds of agriculture, energy, et cetera, in this region. I'm wondering why this doesn't go next. I need to hold it in my hand. Okay, good. Okay, now one of the wonderful things being here is to know the connection with the Arctic and the Himalayas. And one obvious connection is the ice and snow. This is a photograph by George Mallory taken in the 1920s of the Rongbuk Glacier. And we can see this repeat photography taken in 2007 of the very same glacier. So we have a lot of recession and shrinkage of glaciers. Let's zoom in a little bit further on this very same glacier. What's nice is to keep your eye, say, on one particular location on this picture. And you can see quite a huge shrinkage of mass in that area. Now let's go one step further and see, kind of get an indication of how big that is. So you can see in that diagram the climber on that piece of ice. So over that period from 1920 to 2007 has been a tremendous loss of ice in that glacier. So one of the controversies is what is happening to the Himalayan glaciers. And one estimate is there are about 56,000 glaciers in that map I just showed. And there have been a handful of studies on the left side, and there's a line in the middle. The ones on the left of that line say that most of those glaciers are indeed shrinking. However, there are a few, like the Karakoram, that are actually growing. But the fact is we only have a handful of those glaciers that we really do know about. The mountains are obviously the water towers of Asia, and one important fact is that there are about 1.3 billion people living downstream directly dependent on that water resource. The blue are the glaciers and in this region, and so the big question, if we saw a photo like we just did, what's going to happen to our water resources in the future? Now, if we take a river basin like the Indus, this is typically a dry area, and about 20 or 30% of the flow comes from glaciers. If we move over to the eastern side with the Irrawaddy or the Ganges, actually most of the water is from rainfall. So about 5 to 10% from glaciers, most of all from rainfall. But it just brings up another issue that we have to deal with. And what happens if the weather patterns changes, if the monsoon patterns change, then we have another issue about water supply. So one of the big questions we do have to deal with, and it's a global question, is about water resources. Now, Asia, this region, has most of the world's irrigated areas. Dependent on this water. And so as soon as we have an issue with food irrigation, with food security, it becomes a global issue. The downstream of the basins, the red diagrams show the population density, and we can see it's quite high both on the Indo-Gangetic Plains as well as on the Yangtze and Yellow River basins in Asia. And I think there are a lot of similarities with Arctic and the Himalayas, but one of the differences, say, is this very high population density that's dependent on the water resources. Right in the region, there's tremendous hydropower potential, but say right now, and I'm staying in Kathmandu, Nepal, we have about 7 or 8 hours of power cut every day because we don't have the hydropower developed. Right now, there's a tremendous boom in building of hydropower, and that energy somehow is obviously needed, but somehow people are really wondering how to do that in the most socially and environmentally conscious way. The region is also significant for biodiversity. About 4 of the 34 global hotspots are in this region, all kinds of bird life, et cetera. But I think one thing we need to think about is the agricultural biodiversity, because this is the home for our future of our food crops as well. We've been looking for yetis for years in the Himalayas, but it was only about 2 or 3 years ago that this new primate species was found, called the sneezing monkey up in northern Myanmar. And what happens is hunters can find this because when it rains, they sneeze, so chew, like that, and then their nose can't stop the rainfall. But it's amazing that we're still finding those kind of species, as well as other many fascinating species in the area. One of the other threats, though, is black carbon and other pollutants, and this is a diagram showing the pollution coming up from the Indo-Gangetic Plain resting right up on the Himalayan region. The difficulty is that's actually accelerating the snow melt in the area. One of the issues is compared to, say, carbon. This is a problem that is solvable in the near future with several benefits, including less temperature rise, many health benefits, and reduce glacier and snow melt if we could just get our hands around this issue of black carbon. Now, coming to the area, this is showing it's an area that has deep levels of poverty. And basically, what's happening, the bottom line is telling us that in this Hindu Kush Himalayan region, poverty in the mountains is actually greater than in the plains. And in a way, that makes sense. People are living in very fragile, remote environments. But it's very high rate of poverty in the mountains. So some of the issues are how do we grow economically and develop in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region? There are ways. And some of those ways are looking at some of the high-valued products we can get from the region, and how do you get these to markets and sell them. This, by the way, is a particular, what we call a caterpillar fungus. It has special performance-enhancing features, and it's very popular on the market, and it's what they call the Himalayan gold. Now, what else is happening in the region is there are huge levels of outmigration. And who is migrating is one of the big questions. And what this is telling us, that it's mostly the men who are leaving the countryside. About 25% of Nepal's GDP is from remittances from migration. And somebody was telling me that about 1,200 men are leaving Nepal on the airplanes every day out of the countryside. So we do have to pay attention to migration, perhaps a bigger driving force in the near run than climate change in the region. It's also an area of high levels of disaster, about 76 disasters every year in the region. Recently, the Uttarakhand Floods, and you can see Lord Shiva almost up to the head in water, a real tragedy that recently was a wake-up call. But what I'm hoping is it is a wake-up call to collaborate more in the region. What else is happening is we just don't know that much about what's happening in the mountains. This is telling us how many weather stations are at about 0 to 1 kilometer, and how many weather stations are up at 3 to 4 kilometers, about 34, and about 2 above that. So even though the source of the floods is way high in the mountains, we don't have enough data to deal with it. This is another one of the repeat photographies, taken in 1920s. And this is the glaciers are turning into these glacial lakes. And one of the issues is a threat is glacial lake outburst floods. So in Nepal, there are about almost 1,500 of these glacial lakes. There have been 21 glacial lake outburst floods in the recent past, and 24 dangerous lakes almost ready to burst. So one of the issues we talked very much about this morning is the need for regional collaboration to solve these problems. A lot of the rivers are crossing boundaries. We need to discuss with one another to better manage the resources for the future. And some of the ideas floated were around, say, a Himalayan council to discuss these issues. But I think what's happened is that there have been some good entry points with climate change. We can, if we take another look at the regional rivers, and we can set up ways to think right across the Himalayas to see what's going on in various landscapes to get a better idea. Let science try to inform us better what's happening in the region. I wanted to have one last slide to show you that it's not all bad news. And this is another repeat photography, 1987, also in Nepal. And then if we look in the recent past, afforestation. And what it is the power of communities. This is community-managed forestry that's really making a difference in the region. Let me just conclude by saying it's wonderful to have had discussions with the Arctic University, with ideas like Himalayan Council, to share lessons between the countries. We're thinking of different kinds of circles like Arctic or Ice Circle, where we can get together with the Himalayas and the Arctic region to really tell the story to the world about what's happening in two very similar areas. Thank you very much for your attention.